The ex-Marine firearms instructor chose to test Starling's hand strength in front of the class by seeing how many times she could pull the trigger on a Model 19 Smith & Wesson.
While Hopkins headed east, Jodie Foster had gone south to the FBI Academy in Virginia and took on the training of her character, Clarice Starling.
It was just an amazing experience. They took me on all of these obstacle courses and, did marksmanship stuff and a lot of classes about fingerprinting and the psychology, psychological profiling.
For Foster, the greatest challenge was physical.
I wasn't in as good a shape as they were, and I'm much shorter than everybody. So they have these kind of marine obstacles that are made for 6-foot-tall guys, and I'm, 5'3".
You spook easily, Starling?
Not yet, sir.
Actor Scott Glenn didn't spook easily either, but he'd be forever haunted by the things he learned at Quantico from John Douglas, his model for FBI man Jack Crawford.
After I'd been there for a few days, I said, "Thank you for letting me become part of your world." And he said, "You're not really a part of my world." He said, "You want to really become a part of my world?" And I said, "Sure."
Douglas played the actor tapes made by Bedecker and Norris, two serial killers who recorded the anguished cries of the teenage girls they tortured.
And I have all the tapes of the killings, because what they would do is they'd get the victim in the back of the van, and as one guy is driving, the other one would be torturing them, beating their flesh, squeezing their flesh with pliers with an audio tape recorder on at the same time.
So I listened to some tapes and I put them away, and then I unlocked the door and I walked down the hall, and Douglas was standing on the hall, and I had to fight and I just wanted to drop him on the spot. He said, "Now you're part of my world."
While the actors came to grips with the grisly work of the behavioral science unit, Jonathan Demme had begun to map out the filming. One of his early choices was to shoot at the FBI Academy itself.
And at first, when we visited the FBI, I couldn't believe how boring it looked. And I said to him, "Jonathan, we can't shoot here." I said, this place has no character whatsoever. I mean, it's just a blank slate. It's awful. And he said, "That's exactly what I want."
Demme also wanted the entire film to have the tense and mysterious feel Thomas Harris conveyed in his writing. To achieve that atmosphere visually, he gambled upon a risky tactic: repeated close-ups.
When you establish that the characters talk directly to the camera when they're talking to another person, that little by little the audience starts to not notice anymore. But it becomes very disconcerting because they're having these very intense discussions to the eyes of the audience.
What does this guy do? He covets. How do we first start to covet? We covet what we see every day.
It's almost frighteningly intimate, It's like the person's kind of talking into your skull, and yet it's off-putting, and that's a good combination, intimate and off-putting.
Demme knew what he wanted to do. Now all he needed was a space to do it in. He found it in Pittsburgh, where set construction began in December 1989 at an abandoned warehouse. To build their sets, the crew used blueprints drawn in the mind of author Thomas Harris many years before.
The levels of the floor vary from room to room by as much as a foot. There are thresholds to step over, lintels to duck.
Whenever we had a question about something, we would go to the book, and sure enough, there'd be a passage in there that described some aspect of what it was that we were challenged by, to the point where we could say, well, look, here it is. It's in black and white right here.
Walker.
Thomas Harris created his macabre world alone, but making his nightmare real took a small army. When screenwriter Ted Talley came upon the troops finishing their work that winter of 1990, he was overwhelmed.
It was the most exciting feeling. It was like Oz was on the horizon.
It was December 1989 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There, filmmaker Jonathan Demme, known until now for his offbeat comedies, would attempt to turn the horrific vision of author Thomas Harris into a successful movie. At first, he shot darkly comic scenes that didn't sit well with his lead actress.
I was worried that he wasn't going to treat the film with enough dignity and respect. And on the first few days of shooting, there were all these little jokes. You'd see Clarice running and they'd be talking about something important, and then you'd pan over and you'd see like a bunch of guys' butts, I thought, my teeth were gritting. I was like, You know, and I was just very worried that somehow the tone of the comedic black humor tone was going to find itself in this film.
Over the next few weeks, Demi proved her fears unfounded.
The good news is he cut it all out. And I think he was finding his voice, and I think that most directors do this, where the first 2 or 3 weeks, they always include in the process of the movie making things that they're comfortable with that they've done in the past, and then they can have a choice later on to cut that out.
In the end, Demi was Foster's kind of director through and through.
He's somebody who abhors violence, who would never consider making a movie that was violent. This isn't a genre that he's ever considered working in. He's the kind of guy who identifies with the woman in the movie. He's really what we look at as the quintessential female director. That's Jonathan Demme. And he, of course, is like the last person you would ever hire to do Silence of the Lambs, and that's why he's so perfect for it.
For the first 10 minutes of the film, the brilliant psychiatrist turned cannibal is talked about, never seen. Demme builds the tension as agent in training Clarice Starling is sent by the FBI to interview the imprisoned killer. Warned to exercise extreme caution in dealing with the deadly genius, she descends to the cell where he's kept.
Do not touch the glass. Do not approach the glass. You pass him nothing but soft paper. No pencils or pens.
Don't go near the glass. Don't touch the glass.
She's led down to where he is.
She's actually descending into hell. She keeps going further and further down into the basement.
This descent, it was always heading down.
Into this dungeon-looking place.
The sound, there are all kinds of weird submarine sounds. The tension just escalates and escalates. It's building and building and building, and then you deliver to Hannibal Lecter.
And he's calm.
Good morning.
The cell holding this monster was based on the description of Thomas Harris at first.
The front is a wall of bars, but within the bars, at a distance greater than the human reach, is a second barrier, a stout nylon net stretched from floor to ceiling.
Tom Harris is exhaustive in his research when he writes his books. And so we used the book as a primer for making the movie. And for us, it was always what was Tom's choice, and we'd try to honor that unless there was some great reason for going in another direction.
In this case, there was.
In the book, it's written that Lecter's cell is barred, and then it has sort of mesh netting in addition to that, to show that, you know, he's so dangerous that you can't even let him get near the bars.
Jonathan started to become very concerned about how we were going to see Lecter, if we were just going to be constantly looking through bars at him. And if he got on the other side of the bars, he was concerned that the viewer would then feel that he wasn't dangerous enough. We tested every kind of thickness of bar imaginable. This way, this way, this way, you know, 2 inches thick, 1.5 inches thick, inch thick, you know, it just went on, at which point I said, why don't we do like they do now in banks and bodegas? Let's just use plexiglass.
And then the next problem appeared. The actors can barely hear each other.
At which point I said, well, let's do like they do in taxis, where they drill holes, you know, and that way they can speak to each other.
Having the plexi there let Jonathan dissolve the distance between them when he wanted to, or suggest the safety of it when he needed that. And it also gave you that incredible moment where Lecter's face is reflected in the glass next to hers.
And then Hopkins used it. He could smell, you know, things through it. He so got it, and he used it. He used everything that we gave him. He loved being Lecter.
Sometimes, Hopkins' relish for the role confounded his co-star. The words were lifted straight from the dialogue of Thomas Harris, but the way Hopkins delivered them was thoroughly his own. At first, Foster was taken aback.
Oh, Agent Starling, you think you can dissect me with this blunt little tool?
And he started imitating my accent, and I felt this just flush go up of feeling totally humiliated and completely angry at him. As an actor, you know, because, come on, he was imitating my accent, he was making fun of my accent, but that also kind of carried on to the character of somebody who, you know, was sitting there like a piñata, letting themselves be completely berated and having their past taken down and dissected in front of them.
Do you know what you look like to me with your good bag and your cheap shoes? You look like a rube, a well-scrubbed, hustling rube with a little taste. Good nutrition's giving you some length of bone, but you're not more than one generation from poor white trash, are you, Agent Starling?
Playing strength and vulnerability at the same time, you know? I think it's very tricky, because you don't want to see an actor act afraid. You want to see them try and overcome their fear.
While you could only dream of getting out, getting anywhere, getting all the way to the FBI.
You see a lot, Doctor?
What I found as an actor is that very often the thing that's the most moving to you in a film is not so much your soliloquy or your big scene or your monologue, but is something that you react to and something that somebody says to you or does to you, or that's where you find yourself sitting in a chair and being completely aghast about it. And those were the things that kind of ran through my head about Clarice.
The scene's culminating lines were taken almost directly from the book, but the sound that punctuates them was made up on the spot. Another improv from Hopkins.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Anthony Hopkins was on screen for only 7 minutes in that first scene, but the impact he made would be felt by audiences for years to come.
He had just plugged into something on a deep psychological level, you know, it was horrifying. I still think there hasn't been anything that scary since.
Thank you, Barney.
In January 1990, Anthony Hopkins' perfect embodiment of Hannibal the Cannibal sent chills through cast and crew on the Silence of the Lambs set.
I was kind of scared to death of him. I didn't really expect it, and he had that voice, and he just kind of scared me.
But when their scenes were done, the actors discovered the man behind the mask.
I can't even imagine where he pulled that character from. He's like sweet, unassuming, you know, friendly guy.
It was just a joy working with him. And we worked so well together. Both of us come from that school of we don't really talk about what we're going to do. We just drink some coffees and talk about, you know, wine and opera and, you know, other stuff. And then somebody says action, and then we just do it. And that all of the intensity happens on screen.
The funny thing was, if you came and visited the set of The Silence of the Lambs, you would have thought that we were all making a comedy. Not because we took serial murder lightly or any of that, but it was both necessary to keep your spirits up if you were shooting autopsy scenes and all kinds of gruesome stuff, and because that was just the nature of the leader on this set. You know, the director is an upbeat, happy guy, and that was contagious.
Demi's friendly demeanor didn't mean he wasn't aggressive about realizing his vision.
I would worry all the time that we were cutting too much, that this is hard for an audience to follow, especially in a movie where it's going by them one time quickly. It's not a book where you can say, wait a minute, flip back to the previous chapter and see how that was set up or what that meant. So I said, Jonathan, you know, we're going to lose them. They're going to be confused. And Jonathan said, well, you know, better to confuse them for 5 minutes than to bore them for 5 seconds.
Never boring was the relationship between Lecter and Starling, even though they only have 4 scenes together. In their last meeting, Clarice begs Hannibal to help her catch Buffalo Bill, who's hours from killing Catherine Martin, the woman he's kidnapped. Longing to taste her pain, Lecter refuses to help Clarice until she reveals the most intimate secret of her rural childhood.
It's Clarice's worst moment, so now she has to beg. And now she'll have to give up something much more precious than what she's had to give up before.
What did you see, Clarice? What did you see?
Lambs. They were screaming.
They were slaughtering the spring lambs?
They were screaming.
And you think if you save poor Catherine, you could make them stop, don't you? You think if Catherine lives, you won't wake up in the dark ever again to that awful screaming of the lambs?
I don't know. I don't know.
Thank you, Clarice. Thank you.
And he forces her to go back and remember that traumatic experience, and then he kind of savors it and rolls his eyes in the film and says, "Thank you, Clarice." And you get the deep satisfaction that he's tasted someone's humanity, almost devoured it.
With the scene's completion, there was only one matter left to attend to.
If you're going to have a movie that's a classic, it's got to have a classic ending.
In the book, Lecter escapes from prison and sends a threatening letter to Dr. Frederick Chilton, director of the institution where he was imprisoned. That ending wasn't compelling enough for a film. Talley and Demme thought about ways to give Lecter a chance at nabbing Dr. Chilton in the flesh.
He said, boy, if Chilton had fled to a tropical island, we'd all have to go to that tropical island on expense account to shoot that scene. I said, he's going to go to a tropical island.
That sense of Chilton walking down this road with this cannibal in a white suit and a white hat sauntering after him. That's one of the great endings in cinema history.
That's in retrospect. When filming ended in March 1990, Anthony Heald wasn't thinking in such lofty terms.
I had no sense at all that I had participated in something that people would be doing documentaries about 10 years later.
The movie was supposed to come out in the fall, but Orion Studios bumped the release date to promote a film with far more obvious Oscar promise, Dances with Wolves.
And instead of opening prestigiously in September or October in awards season, we're going to open you in February when, things are kind of slow and movies tend to get forgotten.
I thought, oh man, they're burying it. They know it's a stinker.
With no big box office stars and a director whose films barely squeaked out a profit, industry expectations weren't high for The Silence of the Lambs.
We didn't have the major honkin' movie stars. Our previous two pictures hadn't gone through the roof. There wasn't a reason to think, there it is, the next big thing.
Until people saw the film. When they did, almost everyone agreed Orion had a huge hit on its hands.
At the box office last weekend, for the third time, The Silence of the Lambs stayed on top.
Lambs stayed at #1 for 5 weeks, raking in nearly $300 million worldwide. But not everyone was happy with the film.
Stop Hollywood homophobia!
The protest centered on the characterization of serial killer Buffalo Bill. With his feminine clothing and poodle named Precious, many gay men perceived him as a damaging stereotype in an era without positive gay role models.
In thinking back on what we had done, I could understand why they might be upset about it.
In Harris's book, Bill's pathology is more developed, making it clear the killer is sexually confused, not necessarily gay. But the movie had lost some of those subtleties.
And we certainly wished that we had not stepped on those toes and that we had crafted that character in some different way. At least, God forbid, not giving him a white, poodle that he calls Precious.
At first, there were concerns the protests might hurt the film come Oscar time. But then again, what chance did a suspense movie featuring a flesh-eating serial killer have at the Academy Awards anyway?
No way!
I'm dumbfounded. I'm going to wake up any minute.
I was completely and utterly, irrevocably surprised when they called my name out.
The Silence of the Lambs swept the Oscars like no movie in almost 20 years, winning Best Picture, Director, Actor, Actress, and Screenplay.
And there we all were, sweating and giddy and hooping and hollering.
It was amazing. I screamed myself hoarse. I screamed. I could not believe it. It's going to go down in history. It's one of the greatest psychological thriller horror films ever.
The makers of the movie weren't alone. Thomas Harris, the reclusive author, joined in the revelry by sending each of the victorious filmmakers a case of wine. Today, The Silence of the Lambs demonstrates staying true to an author's vision, even if it departs from Hollywood formula, doesn't have to mean disaster. Lambs has a female hero, no sex, and a cannibal as its leading man. In retrospect, who would have it any other way?
I just think we were all really inspired by Thomas Harris's writing. I think that, you know, Silence was just an amazing novel, and it's one of those things that happens to somebody once in their life. I'm very proud of it. Very proud of it.
It's hard to imagine that during the making of The Silence of the Lambs, some Hollywood executives were sure Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins didn't have the box office clout to make it a hit. Well, nobody's perfect. I'm Peter Gallagher. See you next time on Page to Screen.